The scornful words echoed through the restaurant, "Don't touch the owner's table." My daughter-in-law's voice dripped with contempt as she watched me straighten a chair. The mahogany surface gleamed under the copper pendant lights, its small brass plaque reading, "Reserved for owner." She laughed with her influencer friends, mocking the old woman who dared approach their prestigious spot. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the deed to this establishment bore my signature, hidden behind an LLC that had taken me decades to build. Tonight, she'd learn exactly whose table she was sitting at. My name is Eleanor Pierce, and at 66 years old, I've learned that the word family doesn't mean what I once thought it did. The afternoon Camille showed up at my Savannah townhouse with 2 Louis Vuitton suitcases and a smile that never reached her eyes. I was trimming my azaleas in the front garden. The February sun cast long shadows across the historic district's cobblestones, and I watched her designer heels click purposefully up my walkway. "Eleanor," she called out, not Mom, or even Mrs. Pierce, just Eleanor, like we were acquaintances at a country club. "Dan said you wouldn't mind if we stayed for a few days. The contractors are redoing our kitchen." She was already wheeling the first suitcase past me, her Hermes bag swinging from her elbow. No question mark in her voice, no pause for permission. Behind her, my son, Daniel Dan, as he insisted everyone call him now, hauled matching luggage from their Mercedes, avoiding my eyes. "When did you decide this?" I asked, setting down my pruning shears. "Oh, just this morning. The contractors had an opening, so we jumped on it." Camille was already through my front door, her voice echoing from inside my home. "You have that empty guest room just sitting there." I followed them inside, watching as she surveyed my living room with the calculating gaze of an appraiser. My late husband Robert's maritime paintings, the Persian rug we'd bought on our 30th anniversary, the built-in shelves lined with first editions, everything seemed to shrink under her assessment. "We'll only be here a week, maybe 2, Dan said, finally meeting my eyes. He had Robert's jawline, but none of his backbone. "Family helps family, right, Mom?" That phrase. How many times had I heard it over the years when his sister needed a loan for her divorce lawyer? When his cousin required a co-signer for a car he'd eventually total? When Dan himself needed the down payment for the very house they were now renovating money I'd given freely, documented only by a simple promissory note he'd signed with theatrical reluctance. "You might have called first," I said, watching Camille test the firmness of my sofa cushions with her palm. "We'll contribute, of course," she announced, pulling out her phone. $50 should cover utilities for the week. $50. For 2 adults in my home, using my water, my electricity, my space. I thought of my monthly utility bills, never less than 200, and the way Camille took 45-minute showers whenever they visited. "No," I said. The word hung in the air like a struck bell. Camille's thumb paused over her phone screen. Dan's face flushed the particular shade of red that appeared whenever reality didn't bend to his expectations. "Mum, come on." I said no. I walked to the suitcases Camille had deposited in my foyer and stood beside them. "If you needed a place to stay, you should have asked, not announced, not assumed asked, and I would have told you that my home is not a hotel." "This is ridiculous," Camille said, her voice sharpening. "We're family." "Family," I repeated, tasting the word. "When Robert was dying, and I needed someone to drive him to chemo appointments while I worked to keep our insurance, where was family? when I spent 3 years caring for my mother with dementia, visiting her every single day while you complained about the 20-minute drive to see her once a month. What did family mean then? That's not fair, Dan started. Fair. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Was it fair when you brought 12 people here for Thanksgiving without warning? When Camille's sister stayed for 3 weeks and left my guest room stained with self-tanner and wine? When you used my address to establish residency for that private school district without asking? Camille's perfectly contoured face had gone rigid. I cannot believe you're bringing up petty grievances. Petty, I said, moving to open my front door. Yes. Respecting someone's home is so petty. Leave the suitcases. You can return for them after you've found appropriate accommodations. You're seriously kicking us out. Dan's voice cracked slightly, reminding me of the teenager who'd once promised to take care of me when I was old. I'm seriously establishing boundaries, I said. Something I should have done years ago. Camille grabbed her suitcases with sharp, angry movements. This is unbelievable. We'll remember this. Eleanor. I'm counting on it, I said. As their Mercedes pulled away, tires squealing slightly in their haste, I stood in my doorway and felt something shift inside me, tectonic and final. My house settled into quiet, the late afternoon sun warming the original hardwood floors. For the first time in years, my home felt entirely mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Robert's old leather chair, the one Camille had once suggested I replace with something more contemporary, and let the memories unspool like thread from a broken loom. I remembered the morning after Robert died. 4:30 a. Still dark. The hospice nurse barely gone. Dan had shown up at 6 not to comfort me, but to ask about the will. Just so we can plan accordingly, he'd said, as if his father's body wasn't still warm in the next room. I'd made him coffee with shaking hands while he scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing up to ask about specific assets. Then there was my sister Patricia's divorce, 15 years ago now. She'd lived with me for 8 months, her 2 teenagers turning my quiet home into chaos. I'd paid for their school supplies, their clothes, their endless appetites. When Patricia finally got her settlement, she'd moved to a gated community in Hilton Head. The thank you card she sent had a $50 Olive Garden gift certificate inside. For all those dinners, she'd written, as if 8 months of housing and feeding 3 people could be exchanged for unlimited breadsticks. But it went back further than that. Even when Dan was young, I was already disappearing into my own life, working double shifts as a cardiac nurse while Robert built his marine supply business. Every holiday became my responsibility, the cooking, the decorating, the gift buying, even for Robert's family. You're so good at it, they'd say, showing up empty-handed except for their appetites and opinions. I rose from the chair and walked to my study, where years of financial records lived in neat filing cabinets. Here was the loan to Dan's college roommate never repaid, the bail money for Robert's brother never acknowledged, the down payment for my nephew's failed food truck gone like smoke. Each folder represented a piece of myself I'd carved away, handed over, written off. But there was another folder, one I kept in the locked drawer. Inside were different documents, incorporation papers for Riverbend Equity LLC, investment statements showing years of careful savings from my nursing career and Robert's life insurance, property deeds and contracts. While everyone else saw me as the family ATM, I'd been building something else entirely. The Copper Magnolia restaurant was my largest investment, though no one knew it. I'd structured it through the LLC, keeping my name off anything public. The executive chef thought the owner was a reclusive investor from Atlanta. The general manager sent monthly reports to a P.O. box. I'd eaten there dozens of times, sitting quietly at different tables, watching my investment flourish. It had started as revenge against invisibility, a secret fortune to match my secret erasure. But over time, it became something else. Proof that I existed beyond my usefulness to others. Evidence that Eleanor Pierce was more than a convenient resource. I thought about Dan's childhood, searching for where I'd gone wrong. I'd taught him to say please and thank you, to share his toys, to be kind. But somewhere along the way, kindness had transformed into expectation. My open door became an entitlement. My giving nature became his birthright. The photo albums on the lower shelf caught my eye. I pulled one out, flipping through pages of Christmas mornings and birthday parties. There I was, always in the background carrying the cake, cleaning the wrapping paper, wiping tears. Never the center of any photo, always at the edges, hands full of someone else's need. You're too generous. Robert had warned me once, years before his cancer. People will take advantage. They're family, I'd replied, as if that explained everything. Even family needs boundaries, he'd said, but I hadn't listened. I'd thought love meant having no limits, no edges, no point where I ended and others began. Now, at 66, widowed and alone in my beautiful historic home, I finally understood what Robert had meant. Love wasn't the absence of boundaries, it was the presence of respect. And respect was what had been missing all along. I returned the albums to their shelf and locked the financial drawer. Tomorrow, I would call my lawyer about updating some documents. The promissory note Dan had signed for his house down payment included specific repayment terms he'd been ignoring for 3 years. The restaurant LLC needed clearer succession planning. My will needed revision. But tonight, I simply sat in my study, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent in service to others, and made a decision. Eleanor Pierce was done being the family utility. The woman who'd built a secret empire while everyone treated her like a doormat was ready to stand up. They wanted to remember my rejection of their entitlement good, but they had no idea what else I planned to make memorable. The days of silent, selfless Eleanor were over. It was time they met the woman who'd been hiding in plain sight all along. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight. A new day. A new Eleanor. Or perhaps, finally, the real one. The Copper Magnolia sat on East Liberty Street like a jewel in Savannah's historic district crown. I arrived at 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday, when the lunch rush had settled into the quiet lull before dinner preparation. The building itself was a restored 1870s cotton warehouse, its exposed brick walls now home to trailing jasmine and vintage copper fixtures that caught the afternoon light. I breathed in the familiar scent of oak and butter, rosemary and aged beef. As I pushed through the heavy glass doors, the hostess, Maya, smiled with genuine warmth. She knew me as Mrs. Pierce, a regular who tipped well and never complained. "Your usual table by the window?" she asked. "Actually, I'd like to sit somewhere different today," I said, my eyes drawn to the corner where it stood. The owner's table was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, made from a single piece of black walnut. Its surface had been polished until it gleamed like dark water. 6 chairs surrounded it, each one custom-built with leather the colour of cognac. Above it hung a chandelier of hand-blown glass and copper, commissioned from a local artist. The small brass plaque on the table's edge caught the light, reserved for owner. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pierce, but that table is never available." "I know," I said, offering her a reassuring smile. "The regular corner table will be perfect." As I settled into my seat, I watched the restaurant I'd built with invisible hands. The servers moved with choreographed precision, trained by the general manager I'd personally vetted through 3 rounds of interviews conducted via video call, my camera always mysteriously broken. The menu reflected my suggestions, sent through my attorney as investor recommendations: the bourbon-glazed pork belly, the she-crab soup with aged sherry, the chocolate soufflé with cardamom ice cream. My phone buzzed. A text from James Morrison, the general manager. "Monthly report ready. Revenue up 12%. 3 private events booked for March." I typed back from my anonymous email. "Excellent. Proceed with the wine cellar expansion." The executive chef, Marcus, emerged from the kitchen, his whites pristine despite the lunch service. He stopped at a 4-top near the owner's table, chatting with obvious VIPs. I knew from the reports that he believed the owner was a wealthy recluse named R.E. Blackwood. The initials stood for Riverbend Equity, but the mystique served my purposes. I'd structured everything through layers of legal protection. Riverbend Equity LLC owned 78% of the restaurant. The LLC was registered in Delaware, with a Georgia operating agreement listing me as the sole managing member. The public records showed only the registered agent's address. Even the bank accounts were managed through a trust. It had taken me 3 years to plan and execute. The initial investment came from Robert's life insurance and the savings I'd hidden away for decades, small amounts skimmed from grocery budgets. Returns from a secret investment account started with birthday money no one remembered giving me. While my family saw me as the woman who clipped coupons and shopped sales, I was quietly amassing capital. The restaurant had been a shuttered space when I found it, the previous business bankrupted by mismanagement. I'd bought the building through the LLC for cash, then spent 8 months overseeing renovations through my attorney and a project manager who thought he was working for an investment group. Every detail bore my touch, the warm colour palette that reminded me of my grandmother's dining room, the local art featuring Savannah's maritime history like Robert would have loved, the emphasis on sustainable local suppliers that reflected my own values. Mrs. Pierce. Maya appeared at my table. "The chef would like to send out a complimentary appetizer. He noticed you're here on a Thursday instead of your usual Saturday." Marcus had noticed. Of course he had. The man who ran my kitchen with military precision noticed everything, which was why I'd hired him away from a Charleston hotel with a salary package that had raised eyebrows among my fellow silent investors, 2 retired doctors who owned the remaining 22% and never attended meetings. "How thoughtful," I said. And soon a plate of oysters appeared, each one topped with champagne foam and caviar. As I ate, I observed the owner's table more carefully. It was typically empty, maintaining its mystique. Occasionally, James would seat special guests there, food critics, potential investors, local celebrities, always with the caveat that the owner had graciously offered their table for the evening. The mystery had become part of the restaurant's appeal. Food bloggers speculated about the identity of R.E. Blackwood. Some thought it was a tech billionaire, others a foreign investor. If they only knew it was the 66-year-old widow in the corner, eating alone with her Kindle and chamomile tea. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Dan. "Mom, Camille is still upset. Can we talk about this over dinner? Maybe at that new place, Copper Magnolia." I almost laughed. Instead, I typed back, "I have plans." "Come on, Mum, I'll pay." Of course he would offer to pay. At the restaurant I owned, with the money I'd loaned him. For a dinner meant to manipulate me into apologizing. The irony was delicious as the oysters. "Another time," I replied, then turned off my phone. The owner's table would remain empty today, as it did most days. But someday soon, I had a feeling, it would serve its true purpose. Not as a seat of honor for those who thought they deserved it, but as a throne for the invisible woman who'd built this kingdom in secret. The brass plaque gleamed in the afternoon sun, patient as a promise, waiting for its moment of revelation. 3 weeks later, Camille orchestrated her grand entrance into my restaurant like a general planning a campaign. It was a Friday evening, 8:45 p.m., the dining room at peak glamour. She'd brought her entire cohort, 7 women who called themselves influencers, each armed with ring lights and iPhone tripods. I was at my usual corner table, having just finished a bowl of butternut squash soup, when the commotion began. "We need the owner's table." Camille's voice cut through the ambient jazz and conversation. "I know the owner personally. They promised it to me for my birthday celebration." From my vantage point, I watched James's diplomatic smile tighten. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am, but the owner's table requires advance authorization directly from—" "Do you know who I am?" Camille interrupted, her voice pitched to carry. "My mother-in-law practically funded this place." She laughed, the sound sharp as broken crystal. Well, she would have, if she wasn't so stingy with family. But I'm sure R.E. Blackwood knows exactly who the Pierce family is. My spoon clinked against the bowl. The Pierce family. As if she'd been born to it instead of married in 3 years ago. James maintained his composure. "Perhaps another table. We have a lovely 8-top by the owner's table," Camille insisted, already directing her friends toward it. "It's my 31st birthday. Content creation is my job, and this table has the best lighting." They descended upon it like locusts, rearranging the carefully positioned chairs, setting up phone stands, adjusting ring lights that threw harsh shadows on the walls. One woman, wearing what appeared to be a tutu made of tulle and LED strips, actually stood on a chair for a photo. I noticed one chair had been pulled slightly out of alignment, angled wrong against the geometric pattern of the floor tiles. Without thinking, I rose and walked over, reaching to straighten it. "Excuse me." Camille's voice dripped acid. "What do you think you're doing?" "The chair was crooked," I said simply. She looked at me then, really looked, and her eyes narrowed with recognition. "Eleanor." Not a greeting, just an identification, like labeling a specimen. "Ladies, this is Dan's mother, the one I told you about." The influencers tittered, their faces glowing in their ring lights as they filmed everything. "Don't touch the owner's table," Camille said loudly, enunciating each word for her phone's microphone. "This isn't some middle-class establishment where anyone can paw at the furniture. This is exclusive, private, reserved for people who actually matter in this city." One of her friends giggled. "Oh my God, Camille, you're so bad." "I'm just honest," Camille replied, flipping her hair. "Some people need to learn their place." "Right. Eleanor, just like you taught us about boundaries." The restaurant had gone quiet around us, other diners watching the spectacle. Several servers stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. James had disappeared, likely calling the owner's emergency line my anonymous Google Voice number. "You're absolutely right about boundaries," I said calmly. "And learning one's place." Camille smirked, victorious. "See, she gets it? Now, Eleanor, why don't you return to whatever corner you were hiding in? We're about to do a sponsored post for my 12,000 followers." 12,000. She said it like it was 1,000,000, like those bought followers and engagement bots made her royalty. I stepped back, watching as they proceeded to turn the owner's table into their personal photo studio. Camille ordered the most expensive champagne, Dom Perignon, and loudly announced she'd be expensing it as a business cost. They ordered appetizers only to photograph them, letting the food go cold. One woman actually licked the brass plaque for a video, leaving a smear of lip gloss on the words, "Reserved for owner." "This place better comp us something," Camille announced. "All this free advertising we're doing. My post alone will bring in hundreds of customers." I returned to my table and quietly asked for my check. As I signed the receipt, I made a phone call. "Margaret," I said when my attorney answered, "I need you to prepare several documents for Monday." "Yes, the restaurant. It's time." James appeared at my elbow as I gathered my things. "Mrs. Pierce, I'm so sorry about. Send me the security footage," I said quietly. "All of it. Multiple angles?" His eyes widened slightly. We don't usually." "You have my email," I said. "The billing records too. Everything under the Pierce or Hart names." He nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "Yes, ma'am. Tonight. Tonight." As I left, I heard Camille's laugh echo through my restaurant. Can you believe her, acting like she owns the place? The irony was a knife, but I'd learned to appreciate sharp things. They cut clean, after all, and Monday's cut would be surgical in its precision. Walking to my car, I passed the window where the owner's table was perfectly framed. Camille was standing on her chair now, doing some sort of dance for her camera while her friends cheered. The brass plaque gleamed beneath her designer heels, patient and permanent, waiting for truth to restore its dignity. My phone buzzed. James had already sent the first video file. I smiled. Small and private. Camille wanted to teach me about my place. She was about to receive a masterclass in knowing hers. Monday morning arrived grey and humid, typical March weather for Savannah. I sat in Margaret Sinclair's law office at 9 sharp. The conference table between us covered in precisely arranged documents. Margaret, 72 and sharp as surgical steel, had been my attorney since Robert's diagnosis. She was the only person besides my accountant who knew the full extent of my holdings. "You're certain about this?" she asked, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she reviewed my notes. "I've never been more certain of anything," I said, sliding her the USB drive containing the security footage. "Let's start with the restaurant documentation." Margaret opened the first folder. Riverbend Equity LLC, Certificate of Formation, filed in Delaware 18 months ago. Operating agreement showing Eleanor Pierce as sole managing member with 78% ownership. She laid out each paper like tarot cards revealing a fortune. The purchase agreement for the building, the restaurant operation licenses, the trademark registration for Copper Magnolia. "I want certified copies of everything," I said. "And I need you to draft a formal cease and desist letter regarding defamation and fraud, claiming connection to ownership when none exists." Margaret's smile was razor-thin. Consider it done. Now, what about the other matter? I pulled out Dan's promissory note, the one he'd signed 3 years ago with such casual confidence. $150,000, borrowed for the down payment on his house. Terms clearly stated 5-year note, 3% interest. Quarterly payments beginning year 2. And he's paid nothing, not a single payment. I have all the text messages where I've asked, and he's deflected. I showed her my phone, screenshots already organized by date. He keeps saying, family doesn't charge family interest, and when Dad was alive, he would never. But Robert wasn't alive when this loan was made. Margaret noted, no, this was my money, my decision, my terms he agreed to. Margaret calculated quickly. With the missed payments and accrued interest, he currently owes $168,400. I want a formal demand letter, 30 days to cure or begin legal proceedings. That's hardball. Eleanor. That's business. Margaret. She nodded, making notes in her elegant script. Now, about the restaurant situation specifically. You want to implement an 86. Yes. Industry standard, the right to refuse service. I pulled out my research. I want it done properly, legally bulletproof, based on documented harassment of staff, disruption of business, and attempted fraud. Margaret reviewed the security footage on her laptop, her expression growing increasingly disgusted. She stood on the furniture. In designer heels, look at timestamp 11:13 p.m. She's literally dancing on a $10,000 custom table. And this? Margaret paused the video. That's her licking the brass plaque for a TikTok video. Margaret removed her glasses, rubbing her eyes. Eleanor, this is more than enough. We can draft a formal notice of trespass, effective immediately. If she returns, it's criminal trespassing. I want it to include any business in which Riverbend Equity has an interest, I said. The Copper Magnolia, the wine bar next door, the cafe across the street. You own those too. 40% of the wine bar, 55% of the cafe, all through the LLC. Margaret whistled low. You've built an empire. I've built security, I corrected. While everyone treated me like their personal bank, I was investing. While they assumed I was just a silly old woman clipping coupons, I was studying market trends. We spent the next 2 hours crafting documents. The cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. The trespass notice included still frames from the security footage. The demand letter for Dan's loan was precise and unemotional. Now, Margaret said, about the reveal itself. You want to do this publicly. The Savannah Literacy Fund Gala is Saturday. Black tie, 300 guests, including most of the city's social media influencers. Camille already RSVP'd she's sponsoring a table to increase her charitable profile. And you're attending as the owner of Copper Magnolia, R.E. Blackwood will finally make an appearance. Margaret laughed. Actually laughed. You've been planning this. I've been patient, I said. There's a difference. But patience has its limits. What about Dan? This will humiliate him publicly. I thought about my son, about the man he'd become versus the boy I'd raised. Dan made his choice when he brought Camille into our family and allowed her to treat me with contempt. He made it again when he ignored the legal agreement he signed. He made it every time he treated my love as an obligation and my money as his birthright. Margaret gathered the documents into a leather portfolio. These will be ready by Thursday. The cease and desist can be served Friday, giving Camille 24 hours notice before the gala. No, I said. Don't serve it until Saturday night. At the gala. Publicly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. She humiliated me in my own establishment. I said. She stood on my furniture, mocked me to her followers, and claimed ownership of something that belongs to me. She wants to perform, I'll give her a stage. That's cold. Eleanor? That's justice, Margaret, served at exactly the right temperature. As I left her office, my phone had 17 missed calls from Dan and 43 text messages from Camille. Apparently, the restaurant had charged her full price for Friday night, no comps, no discounts, no special treatment. $847 for champagne and appetizers they'd barely touched. I didn't respond. Instead, I called James. The owner's table, I said. Have it deep cleaned and restored. And Saturday night make sure it's properly lit. I'll be sitting there. Saturday arrived dressed in golden light and river breeze. The copper magnolia had been transformed for the Savannah Literacy Fund gala white orchids on every table, strings of warm Edison bulbs creating constellation patterns across the ceiling, and a jazz quartet setting up in the corner. The owner's table held a single reserved sign and a spotlight that would activate at 9 p. When the program began, I arrived at 6:30 p. through the service entrance, carrying a garment bag. James met me in his office, his usual composure barely containing his curiosity. Mrs. Pierce, or should I say, Ms. Blackwood. Tonight, just Eleanor, I said. Until 9. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a simple black sheath dress, the pearl necklace Robert gave me for our 25th anniversary, and his mother's Art Deco bracelet. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. I wanted them to see the woman they'd dismissed, not a stranger in expensive armor. By 7:45, the restaurant was filling. Savannah's social elite mingled with champagne flutes, their laughter creating a symphony of privilege. I stayed in the office, watching through security monitors as guests arrived. Then they entered Dan in his navy suit, the one I'd bought him for his last promotion, and Camille in a red sequined dress that caught every light. Her entourage followed, each woman dressed to dominate Instagram. They'd claimed a table near the owner's table, Camille loudly explaining to anyone within earshot about her special relationship with the establishment. We practically launched this place, she told a city councilman's wife. My mother-in-law's family connections, you understand? Old Savannah money. Old Savannah money. My father had been a postal worker. My mother cleaned houses. Everything I had. I'd built with my own hands. At 8:15 p. Margaret arrived, the leather portfolio under her arm. She found me in the office and nodded once. Everything was ready. The Literacy Fund director began her presentation at 8:45 p. Thanking sponsors and donors. Camille stood to be acknowledged for her table sponsorship $500, the minimum level waving like she'd donated thousands. Then it happened. She grabbed her champagne and headed straight for the owner's table. "This is ridiculous," she announced loudly. "An empty table while sponsors are crammed together, I'm sitting here. The owner would want their supporters comfortable." Her friends followed, giggling and filming. They settled into the chairs, Camille taking the head position directly under the spotlight that would activate in 10 minutes. "Ma'am?" James approached carefully, following our script. "I must ask you to return to your assigned table." "I told you," Camille said. her voice carrying across the now quiet room. I know the owner. We're family. Eleanor Pierce is my mother-in-law, and she's basically a silent partner here. The lie was so bold, so public, that even I felt my breath catch. 300 people were watching. The Literacy Fund director looked mortified. The city councilman pulled out his phone, likely Googling the restaurant's ownership. "Ma'am," James said, his voice stronger now. "The owner has specifically requested. The owner isn't even here." Camille laughed. Blackwood is probably some old money recluse who barely remembers owning this place." Right. Eleanor. And there it was. She'd seen me. I was standing at the edge of the dining room, visible but not prominent. 300 heads turned to look at me. "You're right," I said, walking forward slowly. "The owner should be here." Camille smirked, settling deeper into the chair. "See, even she agrees. Now, can we get proper service at this table?" The spotlight clicked on at exactly 9 p. Bathing the owner's table in warm, theatrical light. Camille glowed in it, her sequins throwing red sparkles across the walls. Her friends lifted their phones, ready to capture whatever came next. James cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Copper Magnolia is honored to host tonight's gala. As many of you know, our owner has maintained privacy since we opened. However, tonight, in honor of the Literacy Fund, a cause close to their heart, they've agreed to make an appearance." Camille preened, assuming this was part of her moment. "Finally, I told you all we were connected. Please welcome," James continued, "the owner and primary investor of Copper Magnolia, managing member of Riverbend Equity LLC, Eleanor Pierce." The silence was complete, absolute. A held breath of 300 people. I walked into the spotlight, my simple black dress a stark contrast to Camille's glitter. Her face went through a symphony of expressions: confusion, disbelief, rage, fear, each one perfectly lit for the cameras still rolling. "Hello, Camille," I said quietly. "You're in my chair?" She didn't move, couldn't move. The sequins on her dress trembled with her shallow breathing. Margaret stepped forward, pulling documents from her portfolio. "Mrs. Hart, I'm serving you with a notice of trespass, effective immediately, for all properties owned or managed by Riverbend Equity LLC." The room exploded in whispers. Phones swung between Camille's face and mine. The Literacy Fund director looked like she might faint. Dan finally found his voice. "Mum, what is this?" "This is my restaurant," I said, still looking at Camille. "My table. My chair that you're sitting in after publicly claiming a relationship that doesn't exist. This is insane." Camille stood, her voice shrill. "You can't." "I can," I said. "And I am." I placed my hand on the back of the owner's table chair, the wood warm under my palm like it recognized me. The spotlight created a perfect circle around us, Camille, her influence a court, and me. 300 guests leaned forward, their charity gala transformed into dinner theatre. "This is mine," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I touch it because I own it. Every grain of wood, every brass fitting, every square inch of this establishment." Margaret stepped forward with the documents, laying them on the table like playing cards. The certificate of formation for Riverbend Equity LLC, the purchase agreement for this building, the operating licenses, all bearing Eleanor Pierce's signature as sole managing member and majority owner. Camille's phone clattered to the table. This is a joke. Dan, tell them. There's more? Margaret continued, her voice cutting through Camille's protest. Mrs. Hart, you're being formally trespassed from these premises for the following documented violations: harassment of staff, captured on security footage at 8:47 p.m. on March 15th. Destruction of property standing on custom furniture in heels at 11:13 p.m. that same evening. Defamation and fraud, claiming ownership connection to defraud the establishment of goods and services. You filmed me. Camille's voice cracked. Every second, I confirmed. Including the part where you licked my brass plaque for social media content. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone actually laughed, quickly stifled. But there, Margaret pulled out another document. The formal notice of trespass applies to all Riverbend equity properties, the Copper Magnolia, Vine Wine Bar, and Clarity Cafe. Violation will result in criminal prosecution. Mom, please. Dan stepped forward, his face flushed. This is excessive. We can talk about... Like we talked about your loan? I asked, turning to him. Margaret handed me the final document. $150,000, borrowed 3 years ago, terms clearly stated, payment schedule ignored, current balance with interest $168,400. I held up the demand letter. 30 days to cure, or legal proceedings begin. You're suing your own son, someone whispered. I'm collecting a legal debt, I corrected. The same way any business would. James appeared with a point-of-sale tablet. There's also the matter of tonight's table sponsorship and bar charges. He showed the screen to Camille. The number glowed $2,347. That's impossible, Camille shrieked. The sponsorship was $500, plus the Dom Perignon you ordered, James noted. 2 bottles. And the Macallan 25 your party has been drinking. Premium liquor isn't included in the gala pricing. I'm not paying. Then we'll process the credit card on file, James said pleasantly. The one you used last week. The machine buzzed to life, printing a receipt that unfurled like a scroll of shame. Camille grabbed for it, her hands shaking. This is extortion. This is business, I said. Something you claimed to understand when you called yourself an influencer and demanded free products for exposure. Well, here's your exposure. Camille. 300 witnesses to fraud, trespass, and vandalism. Her influencer friends had backed away, their phones still recording but distancing themselves from the catastrophe. One actually switched tables, pretending she'd never been part of the group. Dan's voice was strangled. Mom, how could you do this to us? To you? I let the words hang. 20 years of holidays where I cooked while you showed up late. Every family crisis where my door was expected to open, my wallet expected to provide. You told your wife my home was available without asking me. You ignored a legal agreement you signed. You let her publicly humiliate me in my own establishment. I picked up the brass plaque from the table, the one Camille had contaminated with her tongue. This says, reserved for owner, not reserved for people who think they matter, not reserved for family who takes without asking. Owner? That's me? The woman you thought was too stupid to be anything more than your personal ATM? Security, James said quietly. 2 uniformed guards appeared at the dining room entrance. Wait, Camille said desperately. We can work this out. I'll delete the posts. I'll apologize. Your apology is as worthless as your influence, I said. 12,000 bought followers don't make you important. They make you pathetic. The guards moved forward. Camille grabbed her purse, her phone, her friends scrambling to collect their things. Dan stood frozen. The demand letter crumpled in his fist. You have 30 seconds to leave voluntarily, Margaret announced, or law enforcement will be called. Camille ran, actually ran, her heels clicking frantically on the hardwood, her sequined dress shedding sparkles like breadcrumbs. Her friends followed, a parade of humiliation streaming toward the exit. Dan looked at me one last time, something breaking in his expression, before following his wife into the night. The dining room remained silent for a heartbeat. Then someone started clapping. Slow at first, then building. The city councilman stood. The literacy fund director joined him. Soon the entire room was applauding while I stood in the spotlight, holding the brass plaque that bore the truth they'd all just witnessed. Eleanor Pierce owned this table, this restaurant, this moment, and everyone in Savannah would remember it. The dining room had returned to its elegant murmur, conversations resuming with the particular energy that follows witnessed drama. The jazz quartet, professionals that they were, struck up a gentle rendition of Summertime, as if scoring the denouement of the evening's unexpected performance. I stood alone by the owner's table, the spotlight still warming my shoulders. The guards had closed the door behind Dan and Camille with a decisive click, the sound of a chapter ending. Through the window, I could see them in the street. Camille gesticulating wildly, while Dan stood with his shoulders hunched. The demand letter still crushed in his hand like a white flag of surrender. The brass plaque lay cool in my palm. James approached with a bottle of cleaning solution and a soft cloth, offering them silently. I understood. This was my table to reclaim, my moment to restore. I sprayed the plaque carefully, wiping away the smear of lip gloss, the fingerprints, the residue of disrespect. The brass emerged gleaming, the engraved words sharp and clear, reserved for owner. I polished it until it reflected the light like a mirror, then set it back in its place on the table's edge. The wind had picked up outside, sending a shiver through the restaurant's vine-covered exterior. Inside, the gala continued. But something had shifted. People approached me differently now, with recognition, with respect, with the particular distance reserved for those who've demonstrated they won't be trifled with. The Literacy Fund director touched my elbow gently. Mrs. Pierce, that was extraordinary. Would you consider joining our board? Send me the information, I said. I'll review it properly. She nodded and retreated, understanding that my decisions would no longer be made in the moment, pressured by social expectation. Everything would be deliberate now, considered, protected. I pulled out the center chair at the owner's table, the throne Camille had contaminated with her entitlement, and sat down. The leather embraced me, custom-fitted and perfect. From this position, I could see the entire restaurant, my kingdom of exposed brick and copper light, built with money they never knew I had, managed with skills they never knew I possessed. Margaret joined me, sliding a gin and tonic across the walnut surface. Hell of a show, Eleanor. It wasn't meant to be a show, I said, taking a sip. It was meant to be a lesson. Think they learned it? I considered the question. Through the window, Dan and Camille's car was pulling away, its taillights disappearing into River Street traffic. Camille learned she can't take what isn't offered. Dan learned that contracts matter, even with family, especially with family. And you? Margaret asked. What did you learn? I ran my finger along the table's grain, feeling every ring that marked the tree's years of patient growth before it became this surface, this statement, this foundation for truth-telling. I learned that becoming visible after a lifetime of erasure feels like breaking the surface of water, I said. That first breath burns, but it's necessary. The jazz quartet shifted into What a Wonderful World, and couples began dancing in the space between tables. The gala had recovered its equilibrium, adapted to its new narrative. Tomorrow, the story would spread through Savannah's social networks, not Camille's digital ones, but the real ones, the ones that mattered. The woman who'd been invisible had revealed herself as the power behind the throne she'd built. I stood, straightening the chair one final time. It aligned perfectly with its companions, each one exactly where it should be. The owner's table stood ready for its next purpose, whatever I decided that would be. Perhaps I'd host literacy fund meetings here. Perhaps I'd invite other invisible women to sit at my table, the ones who'd been building empires while their families treated them like furniture. Perhaps I'd simply eat my butternut squash soup in peace, knowing that everyone knew exactly whose table this was. James appeared with my wrap, helping me into it with practiced grace. Will you be returning tomorrow, Mrs. Pierce? Every day, I said. This is mine. I don't hide from what's mine anymore. I walked through my restaurant, past the copper fixtures throwing warm light like blessings, past the servers who now knew exactly who signed their paychecks, past the guests who'd witnessed a revolution dressed as a gala. At the door, I turned back once. The owner's table stood empty in its spotlight, the brass plaque catching fire in the light. Perfect. Untouchable. Waiting. The night air tasted like jasmine and river salt. I walked to my car with my shoulders straight, my head high, visible in every sense of the word. Behind me, the copper magnolia glowed against Savannah's darkening sky, a lighthouse marking the spot where Eleanor Pierce had finally, fully arrived. The brass plaque would shine there tomorrow, and the day after, and every day following. Some would photograph it, adding to the legend. Others would request to sit there, only to be politely refused. But everyone would know that table belonged to someone who'd earned the right to say, mine, and mean it. The wind rattled the magnolia leaves as I drove away, but the restaurant stood firm, like its owner. Like the woman who'd finally chosen to touch what was hers, regardless of who was watching. Thank you for listening to Eleanor's story of reclaiming her power and setting boundaries that should have been established long ago. I'm curious, where are you listening to this story? Are you driving through city streets like Eleanor? Perhaps sitting in your own space that you've fought to claim? Or maybe stealing a moment of solitude that belongs entirely to you? Please share in the comments below where you're experiencing this tale of sweet revenge and hard-won respect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of underdogs who refuse to stay down. And let me know your thoughts. Have you ever had your own owner's table moment when you finally stood up and claimed what was rightfully yours? Your stories inspire our next episodes, so please share them below.